When people picture ancient Chinese power, they see armies and emperors, terracotta warriors standing in endless rows, the Great Wall stretching across mountains. But China's dominance came from something quieter, a surveillance machine that knew every subject, not just their names, where they lived, how many children they had, whether they'd moved without permission. And that system's logic runs in every modern state that claims to serve you while watching everything. The Qin dynasty unified China in 221 BCE through military conquest. That's what the history books emphasize. But Emperor Qin Shi Huang understood something deeper. You can't control an empire through force alone. Soldiers need food. Rebellions hide in anonymity. Tax collection requires knowing who exists and where they are. So while his armies secured territory, his scribes built something more permanent. They standardized the writing system, not for culture, for bureaucracy. Every province now used identical characters to record identical information. Household registers, census data, tax obligations. The empire needed legible subjects, and legibility required uniform documentation. Imperial officials arrived in newly conquered regions with bamboo slips and inkstones. They visited every household, recorded every name, counted every mouth to feed. The documents specified family structure: head of household, wife, children, elderly parents. They noted age, gender, occupation, whether the family owned land or rented, how much grain they harvested. Each household received a classification that determined tax burden and labor obligations. These weren't suggestions. Families who failed to register faced punishment. Households that provided false information risked execution. The system demanded participation, and participation meant visibility. The archives at the Qin capital, Xianyang, filled with thousands of bamboo slips. Each slip contained a fragment of the empire, a single household's data, a village's population count, a county's tax receipts. Officials organized them by region, stacking slips into bundles that represented entire provinces. When the emperor wanted information about distant territories, scribes retrieved the relevant slips within hours. The system transformed scattered populations into manageable data. Geography became legible, people became numbers, and numbers could be controlled. The Han Dynasty inherited those archives when they overthrew the Qin in 206 BCE. New rulers, same bureaucracy. The officials who knew how to read the registers kept their positions. The census system continued without interruption. But the Han refined what the Qin had built. They understood that registration wasn't just about counting people. It was about controlling movement. A subject who could relocate freely was invisible. A subject tied to a registered address was trackable. The Han implemented household registration with ruthless precision. Every family received a classification based on their registered address. Moving required official permission. Changing residence meant updating records at both the departure location and destination. Local officials verified the information matched. Travelers needed documents explaining their journey's purpose. Merchants carried permits authorizing commercial movement. Farmers stayed bound to registered farmland. The system didn't just record where people were, it restricted where they could go. Census officials visited households every 3 years. They updated population counts, verified family structures hadn't changed without documentation, checked that registered occupations matched actual work. The visits weren't optional. Families who avoided census officials faced investigation. Those who provided inconsistent information triggered deeper scrutiny. The 3-year cycle meant the empire maintained current data on every subject. Outdated information was useless. Fresh data enabled prediction and control. The Han military depended entirely on this civilian infrastructure. When generals needed troops, they didn't recruit randomly. They consulted household registers. Every male between certain ages appeared in the data. Officials knew exactly how many potential soldiers existed in each region. They could calculate recruitment quotas with precision. Draft notices arrived at registered addresses. Men who fled faced punishment that extended to their registered families. The surveillance system and military power reinforced each other. You couldn't hide from conscription if your family's location was documented. Tax collection followed identical logic. Provincial officials received quotas based on registered populations and land holdings. County magistrates broke those quotas into village-level requirements. Village headmen knew exactly which households owed what amounts. There was no ambiguity. The records specified every family's obligations. When harvest time arrived, collectors appeared at registered addresses with documentation. Families couldn't claim poverty if the records showed land ownership. The system made tax evasion nearly impossible, because evasion required invisibility, and invisibility required avoiding registration entirely. The documents don't speculate, they record what actually happened. Excavated Han Dynasty bamboo slips show census data spanning generations within single families. Grandfather's name, father's name, son's name, all recorded in the same household register updated across decades. The multi-generational documentation meant officials could track family lineages. They knew relationships between households in different regions. When one family member moved, authorities understood their connections to others who remain. The network mapping didn't require ideology. It required documentation and time. But the system did more than track people. It made rebellion impossible. The Tang Dynasty perfected this during their rule from 618 to 907 CE. They inherited the Han registration framework and added a layer that transformed surveillance from administrative tool into social architecture. They called it Baojia, groups of 10 families bound together through collective responsibility. If one household violated laws, all 10 faced consequences. The system didn't require ideological loyalty. It required neighbors to watch neighbors because their own safety depended on everyone's compliance. Village headmen managed the Baojia units. They knew every family in their group. When officials needed information, they asked the headman. When someone acted suspiciously, neighbors reported to the headman. The headman documented everything: minor disputes, unusual visitors, households that seemed wealthier than their registered status suggested. This information flowed upward. Headmen reported to village leaders. Village leaders compiled reports for county magistrates. County magistrates sent bound documents to prefectural governors. Governors forwarded summarized intelligence to the capital. The architecture reveals intent better than any speech. Officials at the top didn't need spies in every village. They needed a structure that made surveillance automatic. The Baojia system achieved this through incentive design. Families protected each other, not from altruism but from self-interest. If your neighbor planned rebellion, you reported them before authorities discovered the plot and punished your entire group. The system turned potential allies into monitors. Communities policed themselves. County magistrates received thick bundles of reports monthly. They contained routine information: births, deaths, marriages, property transfers. But they also flagged anomalies. A household with unexpected wealth. A family hosting strangers without documented travel permits. Someone asking questions about government operations. Magistrates forwarded concerning reports to higher authorities, while filing routine data in local archives. The paper trail meant every documented concern could be investigated later if patterns emerged. The capital processed thousands of these reports. Imperial archives employed hundreds of clerks who organized incoming documents by region, date, and subject. When suspicious activity appeared in multiple provinces, pattern analysts identified connections. A traveling merchant appearing in reports from different counties. Multiple households mentioning the same visiting monk. These correlations triggered investigations that ordinary local officials couldn't detect. The hierarchical flow created intelligence capabilities that exceeded any single official's knowledge. Census data integrated with the Baojia reports. Officials cross-referenced population registers against surveillance observations. If a household claimed poverty in census documentation, but neighbors reported signs of hidden wealth, investigators visited. If registered household size didn't match Baojia headman observations, authorities demanded explanations. The dual documentation streams validated each other. Lies in one system appeared as inconsistencies when compared against the other. When you map the structure, the function becomes obvious. The Baojia system wasn't about preventing crime. It was about eliminating anonymity. In a society where 10 families answered for each member's behavior, nobody could organize resistance. Potential rebels couldn't trust their neighbors. Neighbors couldn't risk ignoring suspicious activity. The structure created perpetual mutual surveillance without requiring government agents in every village. The system ran on self-interest and fear, which meant it ran continuously, without ideological maintenance. Dynasties rose and fell. The records persisted. That control architecture didn't disappear when empires collapsed. It transferred. When the Song dynasty took power in 960 CE, they didn't destroy the Tang archives. They absorbed them. Song officials studied decades of accumulated data about households, land ownership, and regional populations. They inherited knowledge that would have taken generations to rebuild. The documentation continuity meant institutional memory outlasted any single ruling family. The Mongol conquest in 1279 CE should have shattered Chinese administrative systems. Foreign invaders with different language and culture. But Kublai Khan's Yuan dynasty didn't dismantle the surveillance infrastructure. They recognized its value immediately. Mongol officials couldn't read Chinese initially, so they employed the same clerks who had served the Song. Those bureaucrats explained the household registration system, demonstrated how census data enabled tax collection and military recruitment. The Mongols kept the entire apparatus running because it worked. When the Ming overthrew the Yuan in 1368, they executed the Mongol rulers, but they preserved the archives. Ming administrators opened rooms filled with decades of Yuan dynasty records, household registers, tax documentation, lists of former officials and their registered addresses. The Ming used this inherited data to locate potential rivals. Former Yuan bureaucrats appeared in the records with current addresses. Ming agents arrested them using information the previous dynasty had collected. The surveillance system served whoever controlled it. The blueprint is visible if you know where to look. When Han Dynasty forces conquered Sichuan province, census teams arrived before permanent administrators. The military secured territory. The registrars immediately began documenting households. Before the region had stable governance, it had population data. The sequence reveals priorities. Control required information first, administration second. Armies could hold land temporarily, but documented populations could be governed permanently. The Qing dynasty transition in 1644 followed identical patterns. Manchu invaders took Beijing. They found Ming archives intact, provincial household registers, county census records, urban population documentation. Qing officials didn't create new systems. They updated existing records with Manchu administrative terms, while keeping the structure unchanged. A household registered under the Ming remained registered under the Qing. The address stayed documented. The tax obligations continued. Only the dynasty name changed in the paperwork. This continuity wasn't accidental. It was structural. Whoever conquered China inherited millions of documented subjects. Destroying those records meant starting surveillance from zero. New rulers would spend decades rebuilding information their predecessors had accumulated. The rational choice was preservation. Take the archives. Keep the registrars. Continue the system. Every dynasty made this calculation, which meant the surveillance apparatus persisted across nearly 2,000 years of political upheaval. The records reveal what no official history mentions. Chinese power didn't come from superior military technology or philosophical innovation. It came from knowing everything about everyone, where they lived, how they connected to others, whether they'd moved recently, what resources they controlled. This information architecture survived every regime change because information is power, and power structures protect themselves regardless of who claims control. Jump forward 2,000 years. The technology changed, but the logic remained constant. Every surveillance system throughout history discovered the same architecture because surveillance has universal requirements. First, you need collection nodes, points where information enters the system. In ancient China, these were census officials and baojia headmen. The nodes don't require sophisticated technology. They require positioned observers who document what they see. Second, you need hierarchical processing. Raw data from collection points is useless without organization. Village reports flowed to county magistrates. County documents moved to provincial governors. Provincial summaries reached the capital. Each level filtered information, forwarding what seemed significant while archiving routine details. The hierarchy turns scattered observations into actionable intelligence. Modern terminology calls this data aggregation. Ancient administrators called it bureaucracy. The function is identical. Third, you need centralized storage. Information loses value if it's scattered across unconnected locations. Imperial archives at Chang'an contained copies of provincial records. When officials needed information about distant regions, they accessed central repositories. The storage requirement isn't about technology. It's about preventing information loss and enabling cross-referencing. Whether documents sit in bamboo archives or digital databases, centralization enables pattern recognition that local knowledge cannot achieve. When you recognize the pattern, you see it operating everywhere. The Soviet Union implemented internal passports in 1932. Citizens couldn't relocate without government permission. Every person received documentation specifying their registered address. Moving required updating records at departure and destination offices. The Soviet propiska system was identical in function to Han Dynasty household registration. Different ideology, different century, same architecture. Because control requires knowing where subjects are and restricting unauthorized movement. East Germany perfected the collection node strategy. The Stasi recruited informants throughout society. By 1989, East Germany had one informant for every 63 citizens. Neighbors reported on neighbors. Co-workers monitored co-workers. The information flowed upward through regional Stasi offices to headquarters in Berlin. Officers compiled reports into individual citizen dossiers. The files tracked relationships, opinions, activities, travel. The Stasi archives eventually filled miles of filing cabinets. The scale was industrial, but the method was ancient. Distributed observers feeding hierarchical processors, storing centralized records. North Korea inherited Japanese colonial registration systems after 1945. They expanded them into Songbun classification. Every citizen received a political reliability rating based on family history. The classification determined where you could live, what jobs you could hold, whether your children could attend university. The system tracked 3 generations of family background. Officials maintained detailed files spanning decades. Grandparents' actions affected grandchildren's opportunities. The multi-generational documentation paralleled Tang Dynasty family registers tracking lineages across centuries, and that blueprint never stopped running. It transferred from empire to nation-state, from bamboo slips to paper files to magnetic tape to server farms. The tools modernized, the blueprint stayed constant, because surveillance architecture follows universal logic that exists independent of any specific technology or ideology. The architecture you're living inside was designed 2,000 years ago. Modern China understood this explicitly. When they launched the social credit system in 2014, they weren't inventing surveillance. They were digitizing imperial household registration. The function remained identical. Document every citizen, track their behavior, restrict movement and opportunity based on documented compliance. The technology was new. The blueprint was ancient. Citizens receive numerical scores based on behavior. Paying bills on time increases your score. Traffic violations decrease it. The system monitors financial transactions, social media posts, purchase histories, travel patterns. High scores unlock benefits, easier loan approval, better school access for children, permission to book high-speed train tickets. Low scores trigger restrictions. You can't buy plane tickets. Your children face university admission barriers. You're publicly identified as untrustworthy. The collection nodes are everywhere now. Security cameras with facial recognition at intersections. Payment apps that record every transaction. Social media platforms that analyze every post. Smartphone location data that tracks movement continuously. The observers aren't human anymore. They're sensors and algorithms. But the function matches Tang Dynasty Baojia headmen, documenting household activities. The observers are positioned. They record behavior. They feed information upward. The hierarchical processing happens automatically. Local servers aggregate data from regional sensors. Provincial data centers compile information from multiple cities. National systems synthesize the entire country's behavioral data. The pyramid structure is identical to county magistrates, reporting to provincial governors, reporting to the capital. Digital processing is faster, but the information architecture hasn't changed in 2 millennia. Centralized storage now means databases instead of bamboo archives, but the function is the same. Cross-reference information across time and space to identify patterns individual observers cannot detect. An algorithm notices you visited a protest location based on phone GPS data. It correlates that with facial recognition footage from the area. It checks your social media for posts about the event. It lowers your social credit score automatically. No human reviewed the evidence. The system processed distributed observations through hierarchical analysis into centralized action. What looks like modern innovation is ancient practice at digital speed. The Communist Party studied imperial administrative systems. They recognized the control architecture that had maintained Chinese governance across dynasties. They adapted it to digital infrastructure. The household register became a database entry. The census official became a sensor network. The archive room became a server farm. But the logic connecting collection to processing to storage to control remained unchanged. Behind the convenience interface sits a control architecture. Western democracies watched China's social credit system with public criticism and private interest. But the surveillance infrastructure was already operating in supposedly free societies. It just ran through private companies instead of government agencies. The distinction matters less than the function. Corporate surveillance and state surveillance use identical architecture: distributed collection, hierarchical processing, centralized storage. Google processes billions of searches daily. Every query is documented. The search terms you use, the links you click, how long you spend on each page. The system builds behavioral profiles more detailed than any Tang Dynasty household register. It knows your interests, concerns, health issues, political views, relationship problems, financial situation. All voluntarily provided through searches you thought were private. The data feeds algorithms that predict your behavior with precision Han census officials could never achieve. Facebook maps your social relationships automatically. Every friend connection is documented. Every message analyzed. Every photo tagged with facial recognition. The platform knows who you communicate with most frequently, which relationships have grown distant, who influences your opinions. The network mapping exceeds anything Bao Jia headmen could document, because the system processes millions of relationships simultaneously. Imperial officials needed years to map family lineages. Facebook does it instantly and continuously. Amazon tracks every purchase, every product you view, every search within their platform, how long you consider items before buying. The behavioral data reveals income level, lifestyle, priorities, habits. The system predicts what you'll buy next, with accuracy that would seem magical to Ming Dynasty tax collectors, who estimated household wealth from external observations. Now the data is precise, comprehensive, and continuously updated. Smartphone location data functions as digital travel permits. Your phone reports your position constantly. The data shows where you live, where you work, which routes you travel, how often you visit specific locations, how long you stay. Democratic governments don't restrict movement through paperwork like Han Dynasty officials. They simply purchase location data from telecommunications companies and app providers. The tracking is continuous and comprehensive. Ancient census officials visited households every 3 years. Your phone reports your location every few seconds. Credit scoring systems operate as algorithmic household classification. Your score determines which housing you can rent, whether you qualify for loans, sometimes whether employers will hire you. The score reflects payment history, debt levels, credit utilization. It follows you throughout life. Low scores restrict opportunities. High scores unlock access. The function mirrors Songbun classification in North Korea or social credit in China. The mechanism is financial rather than political, but the architecture is identical. Documented compliance determines life opportunities. Democratic governments increasingly purchase commercial surveillance data rather than collecting it directly. Law enforcement agencies buy location data from data brokers. Intelligence services access social media monitoring tools. Immigration authorities purchase travel pattern information. The government doesn't need to build surveillance infrastructure when private companies have already created it. They simply become customers. The legal distinction between corporate collection and government access dissolves when agencies can purchase whatever data they want. The system they don't explain is the one running beneath everything. Every app you install requests permissions, access to location, contacts, photos, microphone, camera. The permissions seem necessary for functionality, but they feed collection nodes. The data flows upward through corporate hierarchies. It gets stored in centralized databases. It gets analyzed for patterns. It gets sold to anyone willing to pay, including governments. They updated the technology but kept the blueprint. Imperial Scribe recorded household movements. Algorithm logs smartphone location. Census official documented family relationships. Social media platform maps your network automatically. Tax collector estimated household wealth. E-commerce company knows exactly what you can afford. Travel permit restricted movement between regions. Credit score determines which neighborhoods you can access. The functions are identical. The architecture is unchanged. Only the speed and scale increased. The structure is visible if you know the history. You can recognize surveillance architecture by identifying its three components. First, locate the collection nodes. What asks for your information? Apps requesting permissions. Forms demanding data. Cameras recording public spaces. Loyalty programs tracking purchases. Every collection point is a sensor feeding the system. When you see requests for information, you're seeing the modern equivalent of census officials visiting households. Second, trace the hierarchical processing. Where does collected information go? Company privacy policies reveal data flows. Information collected locally gets sent to regional servers, then corporate headquarters, then often sold to third parties. The hierarchy exists in every surveillance system because raw data needs organization. When companies explain data processing in vague terms, they're describing the same pyramidal structure that county magistrates used reporting to provincial governors. Third, identify centralized storage. Who maintains the comprehensive database? Social media platforms store years of your posts and messages. Credit bureaus maintain lifetime financial records. Data brokers compile information from hundreds of sources into unified profiles. The centralization enables cross-referencing that makes individual data points powerful. When a company says they aggregate data to improve services, they're building the digital equivalent of imperial archives. Historical validation comes from those who stayed free. Chinese hermits who refused household registration lived in mountains beyond administrative reach. They remained invisible to census officials. They avoided the Baojia system by eliminating neighbors who could report them. They escaped the surveillance architecture by making themselves illegible to the state. Officials couldn't tax someone they couldn't locate. They couldn't conscript someone who didn't appear in registers. Illegibility was freedom. The modern equivalent is information autonomy. Use cash instead of tracked payment apps. Disable location services on your phone. Minimize social media presence. Refuse unnecessary data collection. Use privacy-focused alternatives when possible. These practices create illegibility in digital environments. Every piece of withheld information is a gap in your profile. Every sensor you disable is a collection node you've neutralized. The system depends on comprehensive data. Gaps reduce its effectiveness. The system requires participation. Participation is choice. Ancient Chinese subjects who registered households became legible and controllable. Those who refused registration faced punishment but maintained autonomy. The trade-off remains identical today. Participating in surveillance capitalism provides convenience. Banking apps, navigation services, social networks, personalized recommendations. But convenience comes at the cost of visibility. Every convenience you accept is a collection node you activate. You don't need to reject all technology. You need to recognize the architecture and make informed choices. Which collection nodes serve your interests? Which feed systems that don't benefit you? The blueprint reveals itself once you understand the history. Census officials, Baojia headmen, hierarchical reporting, centralized archives. The same structure operates in every surveillance system because the logic is universal. Ancient China's power came from knowing everything about everyone. That architecture runs everywhere now, just faster, quieter, more comprehensive. But the structure is visible if you know the history. You can see it operating, and what you can see, you can resist.